My name is Max Banfield. Welcome to my talk. Today, I'm here to discuss how the history of chronic fatigue research has been rewritten by changing labels and words to hide the mistakes of the past and take the credit for the new method of treatment. With 48 years of experience in this field, I can confidently claim to be an authority on this subject. And we'll begin by travelling back in time to 100 years leading up to 1975. In the 19th century, chronic fatigue and its associated symptoms was known to be a very common illness called neurasthenia. And later, in the early 20th century, the best researchers in the world were recruited to find an effective treatment, but were not successful. Since then, despite extensive investigations with blood tests, x-rays, CAT scans and cardiographs, no evidence of physical or organic cause could be found. So it was widely regarded as a mental illness where medication and psychotherapy became the prevailing treatments. Graded and forced exercise programs were also applied, on the assumption that gaining physical fitness would make it easier for patients to manage the less strenuous aspects of daily living. Notably, however, virtually all patients dropped out of training. Those overseeing the programs wrongly attributed their withdrawal to the fear of the normal symptoms of exertion and assumed that those individuals had avoided sport since childhood and therefore didn't know the difference between the normal and abnormal responses to strenuous exertion. However, in 1975, I found myself generally afflicted by this illness. I vividly recall the pounding of my heart each time I lifted my feet off the ground, simply by walking down the street. Consequently, I spent much of my time contemplating how I ended up in that situation and how to get out of it. As my doctor was unable to explain my symptoms, and as my condition was not responding to treatment, I decided, out of necessity, to do my own research to solve the mystery. I began by learning the medical language so that I could access the best information in research journals, where I ultimately found more than 100 different labels for the fatigue and its associated symptoms. This indicated how complex and confusing the ailment was. I also learned that at least 5% of the world population, or 250 million people, were affected, with the prevailing view that it was a mental illness under the general label of neurosis, particularly anxiety neurosis, with the patient being referred to as neurotic, and that added the stigma of mental illness to the patient's problems. While I didn't agree with that conclusion, I did initially consider stress as a possible cause, but ultimately found that the symptom occurred in the absence of stress, where there was no stress at all. I also considered the possibility that improving my fitness might bring recovery. So a year later, I enrolled in an exercise program under medical supervision at a fitness research organisation. In the early stages, a research cardiologist, 2 lab assistants and a fitness instructor advised me to think positive, ignore my symptoms and pedal and run faster and faster, as it was the only path to recovery. But that only made my symptoms worse, much worse. Fortunately, I had extensive experience with sport and gymnastics prior to my illness. And I knew that my body's response to such high levels of exercise was not normal. So instead of dropping out, I slowed down and continued at a modified pace. Nevertheless, there was one occasion when I was encouraged to run fast in an indoor relay race, and I collapsed with severe exhaustion for 20 minutes before I had enough energy to lift myself onto a chair with great difficulty. And then it took me a week to recover. I then knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that my symptoms had absolutely nothing to do with fear, and that I had limits to my capacity for exertion. I therefore returned to training with a clear understanding that I would need to stay within those limits. As almost a year passed by, I injured my knee and had to stop training. But I ultimately learned from several more years of experience that I needed to apply the same but more complicated principle of doing everything at my own pace. The head of the fitness research organisation then invited me to write a set of guidelines for other patients to follow, and then to organise a research project to assess its effectiveness. The world first success was widely reported in major Australian newspapers and on an ABC radio program between 1982 and 1983. However, I left the project on the understanding that my method could be used for peer review purposes only, but that if anyone wished to use it as a treatment in exchange for fees, they would seek my permission and pay licence fees and royalties according to copyright law. However, as the years went by, I began to notice a disconcerting trend. Other individuals and organisations were peer reviewing my method and confirming that it was well best, but were not mentioning my name and deliberately leaving the false impression it was theirs. Unfortunately, the public lacks awareness of these facts, and consequently, they may not fully appreciate what so many individuals and organisations are desperately plotting and scheming to hide their mistakes and take the credit for my success. In that regard, during that time, different labels have been used to reflect the physical nature, including the chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, systemic exertion intolerance disease, and more recently, long COVID, where the main symptom is chronic fatigue. In the current times, there is a discernible scenario where my method can be compared to a jigsaw puzzle, where its individual aspects have been disassembled and tossed across the table, where each piece has been relabelled and then reassembled to create the false impression that it is a new combination in 2023. Patients are now being reassured that they are not mentally ill, and my words, train at your own pace, have been copied with pacing is the best treatment. My phrase, being forced to run fast can make you worse, has been replaced with pushing can be harmful. And stay at your own level or within limits has been written as stay within your energy envelope. And my conclusion that it involves a reduced capacity for exertion has been duplicated as it is an energy limiting disease, etc. Everything I did has been copied and changed in wording only. More recently, teams of researchers are using AI and recruiting thousands of patients to use smartwatches and record their daily activities and energy levels, again, in a calculated attempt to duplicate my findings. I will end my talk by reminding you that in 1975, the prevailing belief was that chronic fatigue was a mental illness treated by psychotherapy, and that by 1982 I established physical limitations as the cause and developed a set of guidelines on how to treat it effectively. Nobody else contributed to those guidelines, and nobody has been able to improve them in the 40 years since. They have simply changed the labels and words to hide the real history and usurp the credit. In order to succeed, they need to convince you and the public that I don't exist. I therefore seek the support of other patients, the public, healthcare professionals, and the media to give credit where credit is due and tell the public that I do exist and that I did develop the modern method of treatment. I can then return to clarifying the mysteries of chronic fatigue and its 200 associated symptoms that continue to confuse and frustrate the researchers, healthcare professionals and patients of today. And I'd much prefer to do that. Thank you for watching. I invite you to tell all of your friends about this video and ask them to watch it. Thank you again.